You expect, when someone says the word Bastogne, to think of winter maps and shouted orders, of tanks groaning through mud and the staccato cough of rifles. You expect the grind of 20th century steel and the cold arithmetic of wars whose histories have been written in neat margins. But picture, instead, a place that keeps a different kind of silence, not the silence of trenches and memorials, but the hush of ground that has swallowed centuries and refuses to cough them back up. Picture fog clinging to fields where farming tractors now pass, and beneath the furrowed soil a pattern of ditches and post holes that fit no known settlement plan, a small, stubborn cluster of architecture that historians and archaeologists only stumbled upon by accident, an outpost that seems to belong to a map that nobody alive remembers drawing. That paradox, familiar name, unfamiliar past, is exactly where our story begins. Here, the expectations we bring from textbooks meet an astonishing local mystery, and the friction between what we know and what we do not know creates its own kind of heat. Right away I should tell you what I promise: big revelations, close readings of evidence, and honest questions that do not bow to the temptation of easy answers. We will examine artifacts under microscopes and listen to village gossip that has the shape of an argument. We will follow trade routes marked on pottery shards and weigh them against legends of giant travelers and cursed stones. Along the way we will meet competing theories, sober ones from laboratories and speculative ones from pub tables, and we will let each have its say. Above all, we will keep the mystery alive. There are things modern science has explained beautifully, and there are things it has not, and the places where those two circles do not overlap are the most interesting spaces to stand in. As we walk that boundary together, you will be asked, again and again, to imagine, to doubt, and to wonder. The outpost around Bastogne is small in archaeological terms, a scattering of shallow foundations, a handful of hearths, and a ring of post holes that betray the presence of structures of wood and thatch rather than stone. But size, as we will see, is not the same as insignificance. This site sits like an island in an ocean of better understood strata. To the north and east, Bronze Age and Iron Age farming communities left the usual trace: burial mounds, pottery that matches known styles, a lattice of field boundaries. To the south, Roman roads hum faintly under modern asphalt. To the west, medieval villages are as predictable as church spires and satellite imagery. Yet within that predictable zone there is a locus of anomaly, artifacts fashioned from materials traded across surprising distances, bones with cuts inconsistent with the butchery techniques of known cultures, and an arrangement of features that suggests something like an intentional seaward orientation, except there is no sea in these parts. The outpost does not fit the neat storylines, and that mismatch is where the story will live. We will not pretend to have solved this. I want to be blunt. Much of what follows is a scaffold of observation and interpretation, built on the careful work of technicians and the animated speculation of storytelling. At the same time, the evidence is stubborn. There are radiocarbon dates that refuse to synchronize cleanly with expected timelines. There are isotopic analyses of tooth enamel that suggest diets including fish indigenous to regions hundreds of kilometers away. There are lead isotope signatures on metalwork that point to ores from mountains not normally associated with the region's trade networks. Put those things together and the map that floats in our heads, of where people lived, how they moved, what they ate, begins to shimmer and slide. That shimmer is not an error. It is the trace of a story we have not yet learned to read. As we explore, I will talk to you directly. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, the breath steaming in the cold air, and the stone walls of a 17th century farmhouse passing your right shoulder. Imagine lifting a turf and finding a compact layer of charcoal and bone, and feeling the sudden, private thrill of discovery. Imagine then that the bone does not come from the species you expected, and that the charcoal yields a date that shifts the context by centuries. That disorientation is the point. We are asking for your curiosity, but also your patience with ambiguity. We will hold evidence side by side with myth, call out every confident inference, and leave room for wonder. Keep in mind, archaeology is a detective story without all the pages. The clues are real, but the narrative that joins them is always provisional. Still, for all the provisionality, the site around Bastogne insists on having a voice. And it is time to listen. There are at least half a dozen threads to pull. Some are geological and mundane: soil chemistry, palynology, the way frost heaves can fold a site into chaos. Some are cultural and complicated: trade networks that connected distant peoples, religions that crossed rivers and tongues, sequences of occupation that one moment look like settlement, and the next like ritual space. And some threads are downright uncanny: skeletal remains of unusual size, basalt stones carved with marks that resemble alphabets never recorded in local epigraphy, and oral traditions that describe an outpost where the moon came down to rest for a winter. Phrases that sound poetic until you realize many independent witnesses used variants of the same words. Put all those threads in your hands and you feel the shape of a puzzle large enough to be worrying. But here's where it gets tricky: modern disciplines tend to speak different languages. Geochemists report in parts per million, historians cite charters by date, folklorists map motifs across centuries, and lab technicians publish p-values in journals behind paywalls. When the same evidence passes through these many filters, meanings can dilute or intensify depending on the interpreter. So I promise you this: when we talk about dates, measurements, or isotopes, I will translate. When we talk about myths, I will also connect them to material facts where possible. Most importantly, we will always close each segment with an honest line: we still don't know. That will keep this investigation both humble and alive. Let us begin, then, not with the grandest claim but with a single, crisp teaser. The outpost's centerpiece is a circular ditch, 22 meters across, with inner post holes that suggest a roof structure. But the ditch contains no domestic refuse, and that absence is more meaningful than any single shard. The site's architects might have intended secrecy, or ritual, or something else entirely. In any case, the pattern is deliberate. Radiocarbon samples taken from charcoal within the ditch have returned calibrated ages clustering around two separate ranges, one in the late 1st millennium BC and another, surprisingly, in the early centuries C. That split suggests either two distinct episodes of use or contamination and complexity in the site's stratigraphy. Either way, you are already inside the puzzle. Now, let's be fair: the simplest explanation is often the best: a reused ritual pit on an old sacred footprint. But the artifacts recovered from its fill refuse simple explanations. Pottery fragments include a type of graphite tempered ware known in coastal contexts, not inland ones. Bone isotopes point to marine protein in a population we expected to be inland farmers. And there are work stone pieces with drilling marks that suggest a technological skill set not commonly attributed to the region in that era. Still, for all the evidence, we must keep asking: who built this ditch? Why did they orient the structure the way they did? And, most vexing of all, why would an inland community adopt materials and techniques associated with coastal trade networks? One line of theory emphasizes practical trade and migration. Maybe this outpost was a waypoint in a long-distance exchange system, a modest hub where itinerant traders hoisted weights, exchanged wares, and left traces like fish scales in a midden. If that were so, the outpost might help us rewrite the map of movement for ancient Europe, not a network of highway-like Roman roads alone, but 1,000 small channels of exchange where local knowledge mattered more than imperial infrastructure. Another theory goes cultural. A community here adopted foreign ritual practices. Perhaps the circular ditch marks a rite of passage imported by seafaring visitors, or returned migrants who carried new ideas back inland. A third theory, darker and more speculative, plays with population displacement. Climate events or conflict might have pushed coastal peoples inland, creating enclaves whose material culture reflected their origins. Each theory fits some data and not others. Weigh them in your head like coins. They make a clinking sort of music, but no single coin buys the whole truth. Now imagine the scene. You stand at the lip of the ditch at dawn, your boots sinking slightly in the peat-like soil. Mist boils off a depression a few paces away where a hearth once burned. Crows wheel above the alder trees. The ditch seems small against the horizon, but it carries an odd intimacy, like the footprint of a vanished house. If you listen, you might hear, or think you hear, the scrape of ancient tools. That is the dangerous pleasure of archaeology. You are invited to overlay your imagination on the evidence, and sometimes your imagination fits. But we will be careful not to make that overlap into a verdict. For now, we still don't know why this ditch held objects that imply connections far beyond its fields. Let's turn to another thread, the bones. At a nearby burial cluster, archaeologists found a handful of inhumations that do not match local mortuary practices. The graves are shallow and lack grave goods in the style of the region. Instead, there are carefully placed slabs of basalt and a scattering of marine shells. At least 2 skeletons are larger than the local population average, with long bone measurements that push them into a size category often described in legend as the giants who walked before recorded time. If you are rolling your eyes, be patient, the evidence is messy. Metric data show that while some individuals have superaverage stature, they are within plausible human variation. But the pattern of muscle attachment on certain femora and the cut marks on rib bones suggest specialized activities and violent encounters that historians have not linked to the region. There is also the odd presence of dental filing in one specimen, an intentional modification associated in some cultures with rites of passage, not with the funerary customs of local communities. Competing explanations here are lively. One account is biological. Genetic variation and nutritional status could explain larger size and the differences in bone morphology. Another is cultural. These were visitors who practiced different mortuary rites and body modification. A third account turns on conflict. Perhaps this group was a warrior contingent whose funerary treatment reflected battlefield losses rather than domestic death. And finally, a mythic interpretation insists on giants and lost tribes. But as a documentary writer, I must stress that mythic here doesn't mean false. Instead, it indicates narratives communities use to make sense of exceptional physical remains. Still, for all the evidence, we must close this loop with humility. We still don't know whether these burials belong to locals, immigrants, or some hybrid community whose identity shirks the neat boxes historians like to keep. But there is more: the carved stones. Scattered around the perimeter of the field are boulders of basalt bearing incisions that, at first glance, look like letters. Some researchers have compared the markings to runic alphabets, while others point out that similar linear marks are common in quarrying, guides carved to orient splitting. What's curious about these stones is not simply the marks but their placement. At each of the 3 stones nearest the outpost, the incisions face inward, as if they were meant to be read from the enclosure rather than from the road. Moreover, the incisions exhibit a degree of finesse, fine, shallow grooving achieved through an apparently consistent stroke, not the flaked, haphazard incisions of quarrying. Could these be a local script? A ritual glyph? Or are they later graffiti carved by bored soldiers in the medieval centuries? The answers slide between possible and plausible without landing. Let us imagine again. You squat beside one carved stone, press a glove to a groove, and your fingers pick up the faint warmth of a sun that set an hour ago. Your mind wants to decode the mark, but the marks refuse to be pinned down. That refusal matters because it keeps the outpost from being politely categorized. It insists on being, at once, artifact and argument. Still, for all the arguments, we must say plainly, we still don't know who made those incisions or why they were oriented to the interior. What binds these threads together, ditch, bones, carved stones, and the odd pottery, is a recurring motif of arrival and departure. Objects in the fill include not just pottery but also fragments of glass whose furnace chemistry matches coastal production centers, and a small bronze alloy object with a composition commonly found in mountain smelting zones hundreds of kilometers away. Trade, then, seems more than a metaphor. Isotopic signatures on human and animal remains indicate movements across landscapes, not just local mobility. This is significant because movement doesn't just carry goods, it carries ideas, technologies, genes, and stories. An outpost, even a modest one, can serve as a crucible where all of those circulate. Still, you must keep asking, why here? Why would itinerant networks thread through this particular valley and not another, given a landscape that, superficially, offers no superior advantages in water, soil, or defensive posture? Several environmental studies offer clues. Palynological cores show phases of woodland opening in times that correspond with the outpost's radiocarbon dates. Those openings could reflect human clearing for pasture or the aftereffects of climatic anomalies. When corridors open in the forest, people move differently. Paths that were once impractical become traversable. A minor climate shift, then, might create an opportunity for trade routes to reroute inland for a generation or two. That hypothesis does not make the full story, but it helps explain why a place like Bastogne might suddenly glow on the map of movement. Of course, another possibility is deliberate secrecy. Imagine a society that intentionally hides certain practices, sacred rites kept away from the main villages, or a smuggling corridor that benefits from obscurity. Oral traditions from nearby hamlets speak of a winter when strangers stayed in the hollow, and of a stone that hummed when you put your ear to it. Phrases that sound like folklore until one notices their recurrence across independent informants. Folk memory is not a reliable chronicle, but it can preserve kernels of fact. A stone that hums might have been a grinding stone struck to call people, or a geological feature that resonates at certain temperatures. The point is not to convert myth to science but to see how myth preserves the contours of real experience. Now, let's be fair to the skeptics. For every pattern we describe, there are plausible, earthbound explanations: contamination in dating labs, misattribution of skeletal size, later medieval reuse of older materials. Science forces this skepticism on us, and we are the better for it. Yet skepticism must not become lazy dismissal. When multiple independent lines, radiocarbon, isotopic chemistry, typological analysis, and oral testimony, all point to an anomaly, the anomaly deserves attention rather than quick erasure. In the quiet of that recognition we arrive at the core of our investigation. These are not mysteries because we lack imagination. They are mysteries because they challenge the classificatory habits of academic disciplines. They ask us to hold several frameworks at once, and to let the uncomfortable overlaps shape our questions. So, as we close this opening exploration and step toward tighter detail, imagine again the foglit morning, the ditch, the basalt incisions, the unusually tall skeletons. Picture yourself tracing the edge of the outpost with a trowel, revealing traces of charcoal and bone like a painter uncovering an underlayer. Hear the careful, controlled breathing of the archaeologists, the muttered debates, the catalog numbers about to be written into logbooks. The scene is both prosaic and charged. The everyday labor of digging meets the long, strange itch of not knowing. Keep that tension in mind as we turn to the first of the site's distinct mysteries, because each one will ask you to hold equal parts evidence and imagination. The hollow circle at the heart of the outpost, a neatly dug ditch some 22 meters across with interior post holes and an absence of ordinary domestic refuse, is the first mystery we must sit with, because it asks a question so simple it almost seems rude. Why build a space that looks like a house but behaves like a secret? Picture this as a single-sentence teaser. The hollow circle at Bastogne looks like a domestic enclosure but refuses the habits of home. Now let me paint the fuller picture for you with dates, cultures, and measurements that matter. The calibrated radiocarbon dates from charcoal collected in the ditch's primary fill cluster in two ranges: a denser cluster between roughly 350 BC and 50 BC, and a later cluster centering around 120 C to 220 C. That temporal spread suggests episodes of activity separated by generations, perhaps two distinct occupations or ritual reuses of a single locus. Culturally, the earliest range sits within the late Latine horizon in this corner of continental Europe, a period associated with Celtic-speaking communities who, in other regions, produced finely decorated metalwork and complex burial rites. The later range falls within the Roman imperial era, when provincial economies and networks shifted under the weight of empire. Those cultural labels are useful shorthand, but the site resists easy assignment. The ditch itself measures 22 meters in external diameter with an internal diameter of roughly 16 meters after accounting for slumping and modern disturbance. Post-hole diameters average between 0.25 and 0.4 meters and occur at intervals suggesting a substantial roofed structure perhaps 5 to 7 meters across, a domestic scale, nothing palatial. Yet the fill lacks the expected domestic detritus. No broken spinning whorls, no concentration of animal long bone refuse that would betray routine butchery, and no hearth-centered midden typical of small farmsteads. Instead, the fill yields a thin lens of finely crushed charcoal, occasional sherds of a graphite-tempered pottery more typical of littoral sites, fragments of marine mollusk shell, a small bronze object whose compositional lead isotopes match ores traced to alpine smelting districts, and a scattering of microdebitage from worked flint that shows pressure retouch techniques associated with coastal knapping traditions. Taken together, these finds point not to a simple home but to a place threaded into networks of movement and choice. Goods moved in, certain actions were performed, and then the locus was deliberately closed and left. If we step back and look at the broader landscape, the outpost sits amid an ecotone. To the west, higher chalk uplands. To the east, a broad wet valley fed by tributaries that connect, hydrologically speaking, toward drainage basins running to distant coasts. Palynological cores from a peat bog 2 kilometers to the north reveal a phase of abrupt woodland thinning beginning around 400 BC and persisting in waves into the 2nd century CE, a pattern that could indicate human clearance for pasture or be the signature of climatic variability that opened travel corridors. In other words, the outpost does not sit on an island of advantage but on a threshold where the landscape itself periodically made movement easier. Paths that had been marginal became usable. Streams that were previously tricky for fording calmed in dry decades, and vaunted coastal traders might have found inland shortcuts during certain weather patterns. This environmental context supports one of the more prosaic theories, that the hollow circle served as a transit node in a web of seasonal exchange, where itinerant people, fishers, metalworkers, or specialist craftsmen, camped and performed specific tasks before moving on. But let's be fair. The artifact assemblage complicates that tidy picture. The graphite-tempered ware in the ditch, for example, is not merely a coastal-style vessel. Microscopic analysis of its clay matrix indicates inclusions of marine microfossils that are typically found in estuarine deposits some 200 kilometers away. The bronze alloy fragment, when subjected to portable X-ray fluorescence and then cross-checked with lab-quality mass spectrometry, shows trace element signatures, notably elevated bismuth and a pattern of lead isotopes, that align most closely with ores exploited in alpine valleys known for early Roman-era metallurgical sites. The marine shells, when examined for species and growth marks, include both rapid-growing littoral bivalves and a slow-growing oyster species whose oxygen isotope ratios indicate growth in colder, northward-influenced waters. In short, the material world of the ditch is cosmopolitan in a way that jars with the site's modest physical footprint. Movement and exchange seem real, not imagined. So we must ask how to interpret this cosmopolitanism. One robust theory treats the hollow circle as a worksite for specialist mariners or metalworkers who moved inland seasonally, bringing materials and techniques with them. In that scenario, the ditch is a kind of field workshop where coastal trades were practiced away from prying eyes or inconvenient port taxation, a place to process material brought from a distance, and then conceal the evidence in a deliberate, non-domestic fill. This aligns with ethnographic analogues where mobile craft specialists set temporary camps at predictable seasonal loci. The sharing of marine resource knowledge inland also fits isotopic evidence from some human teeth recovered near the outpost, not crucially within the ditch itself but within a proximate scatter, where elevated marine protein signatures suggest that at least some individuals consumed significant seafood, either directly or through trade, during formative years. That pattern matches a model of itinerant specialists whose diets, tools, and craft knowledge carried coastal signatures into interior spaces. A second theory, less operational and more ritual, posits that the hollow circle marks a deliberately liminal space for ritualized acts connected to water and horizons. Circular ditches and enclosures are common in many European ritual landscapes and often delineate places of transition, from youth to adulthood, from the profane to the sacred, from land to water. The absence of ordinary domestic refuse would then make sense, if the space functioned primarily for episodic ritual, sacrifices, feasts, or oath-making ceremonies. Participants might have removed detritus or structured the filling process to avoid leaving ordinary garbage. The marine shells and coastal pottery could be votive offerings arriving with pilgrims or participants who journeyed specifically to deposit objects associated with other places. The basalt slabs near the ditch, some bearing enigmatic incisions, could have served as altar stones or markers oriented to a particular astronomical or topographic sideline now lost to us but visible to ancient observers who timed their rites to moon phases, star risings, or the flow of seasonal water. Imagine a midwinter ceremony where a coastal-born group brings shell and woven cord to an inland hollow and speaks invocations before the hearth is gently smothered and the place sealed. That is a compelling cultural rendering of the material facts. A third, more unsettling theory turns to population movement driven by disruption. From around 350 BC onwards we see climatic variability and socio-political pressure in many parts of Europe. If coastal communities experienced resource stress or conflict, groups might have migrated inland temporarily or permanently. The hollow circle could therefore represent the footprint of a displaced enclave, a transplanted pocket of coastal people reconstituting elements of their ritual and craft life in a foreign landscape. This model accounts for the coastal signatures and the anomalous mortuary practices found in nearby burials. It also explains why the site might be deliberately hidden or modest in scale. A people on the move will avoid large, conspicuous settlements. While migration explains many artifacts, it also raises uncomfortable questions about relations with established inland communities. Were the newcomers integrated, pushed to margins, or violently opposed? Evidence of conflict is ambiguous at Bastogne. Some nearby contexts show cut marks on bones and signs of perimortem trauma, but stratigraphic mixing complicates the interpretation. Still, the migration model remains plausible, particularly when combined with environmental reconstructions showing windows of inland accessibility. Now, let us not neglect methodological explanations. Dating can be messy. Old wood, residual charcoal, and bioturbation can introduce older or younger material into a context, producing the illusion of multiple occupations where only one actually occurred. Soil chemistry can mimic marine signals under certain post-depositional conditions, and trade networks can be complicated by brokers who move goods far from point of production. In other words, the cosmopolitan signature might partly reflect complex site formation processes rather than straightforward human mobility. Yet the multiplicity and independence of the lines of evidence, radiocarbon dates from different labs, isotopic assays from multiple individuals, and compositional analysis of metals, make a purely taphonomic explanation less satisfying. The most conservative account is therefore not one single causal story but a mosaic, occasional phases of specialist activity, episodic ritual use, and a background of regional movement. But here's where it gets tricky in an even more provocative way. The hollow circle's orientation and the placement of 3 carved basalt stones facing into the enclosure evoke purposeful sidelines. Landscape archaeology has taught us that orientation is rarely accidental. The 3 stones sit roughly on a north-south arc that, when viewed from the ditch's center at the equinox dawn, frames the tip of a distant ridge where a faint depression collects morning mist longer than surrounding slopes. Could that ridge have been a deliberate horizon marker, a place where returning traders or migrating groups could align their approach with a known landscape signal? Or could it have been a practical choice for a navigational corridor in poor weather months, when the ridge's mist offered a visible cue for inland marchers? The incisions on the stones, shallow, parallel grooves made with a consistent stroke, have provoked debate. Some epigraphers argue that their linear simplicity precludes reading them as script. Others note faint diagonal marks that, when combined, suggest symbolic notation rather than mundane quarrying guides. The incisions have been compared to proto-runic forms, but such comparisons are tenuous and risk imposing later alphabets backward in time. Yet the orientation and workmanship of the stones do suggest intention. Whoever placed them cared about how the interior of the hollow circle experienced specific views. Now, picture yourself standing in the ditch at dawn. Mist curls in the low spot by the ridge. You can feel the damp in the soles of your boots. The basalt stone's incisions catch what little light there is, and for a moment you sense the choreography of human movement. People arriving, turning, depositing objects in a deliberate order. Picture the smell of a hearth smoldering, the crackle of peat, and the low murmur of voices speaking in a tongue you cannot parse. That vivid image is the tool of an engaged imagination. It helps us understand function, but it can also mislead if we let it outrun evidence. Still, one reflective insight remains: whether the hollow circle served as a workshop, a ritual locus, a refugee camp, or some hybrid combination, the outpost reveals the porousness of ancient boundaries. It reminds us that borders between inland and coast, ritual and domestic, local and foreign, were often negotiated rather than fixed. Human lives moved across those thresholds in messy, unrecorded ways, and the hollow circle is one physical residue of such negotiations. Finally, we have to close the argument where any honest investigator must close it, after weighing environmental data, artifact composition, mortuary anomalies, and landscape orientation, after comparing methodological possibilities and cultural scenarios, after imagining the hollow circle in fog and sunlight, we still arrive at a limit. The evidence constrains plausible stories but does not yield a single unavoidable narrative. We can prefer one model over another with varying degrees of confidence, but each model leaves questions open. So we end this segment with the only honest refrain left to us: we still don't know. The burial cluster that lies a short walk from the hollow circle reads at first like a misfiled chapter: shallow graves cut into the hummocky soil, basalt slabs set as crude markers, and a scatter of shells laid like punctuation beside a few skulls, a single-sentence teaser for what follows. The graves at Bastogne hold people who look familiar to the bones yet foreign to the customs of the land. To give you a sense of scale and date, the inhumations in this cluster number 14 in the excavated area, oriented roughly northeast, southwest, with grave cuts ranging from 0.5 to 0.9 meters in depth and grave lengths averaging between 1.6 and 2.1 meters. Radiocarbon determinations from collagen samples taken from 3 of the more complete skeletons produce calibrated ranges clustering in the late 1st century BC to the early 2nd century CE, broadly overlapping the later occupation phase hinted at in the hollow circle's stratigraphy. Culturally, these dates place the burials amid the complex horizon of late Iron Age transformations and the early Roman provincial overlay, a time when local social orders were shifting, when mobility increased and material signals became as much about identity as utility. When bioarchaeologists first laid these remains out on the lab table, they noticed differences that could not be dismissed as mere taphonomic accident. Femoral lengths for 3 adult males average around 47.8 to 50.5 centimeters, numbers that translate, by standard osteological estimation, into living statures roughly in the region of 1.85 to 1.95 meters, significantly taller than the mean statures reconstructed for contemporaneous inland agricultural groups in this area, which cluster nearer 1.65 to 1.72 meters for males. The ribs and limb elements of a subset of the skeletons display robust muscle insertion sites, suggesting heavy habitual activity of a particular kind, repetitive loading consistent with hauling, or work, or combat. Dental analysis revealed 2 striking patterns. First, 1 adult female showed deliberate anterior dental modification in the form of filing across the incisors, an intentional cultural practice seen in other regions as a rite of passage or a marker of group belonging. Second, a number of teeth carried microstriations and were consistent with the use of teeth as tools for softening or gripping cordage, again pointing to a life of craft or maritime labor rather than purely agrarian routine. Beyond measurements and markers of activity, cut marks and perimortem trauma complicate the scene. 2 skeletons bear perimortem trauma on the skull consistent with heavy blunt force impacts, and several long bones show cut marks that could be interpreted as scalping attempts or post-mortem defleshing. Alternatively, those cuts might relate to funerary excarnation or ritualized dismemberment. The osteological stress indicators, parodic hyperostosis in a few juveniles, enamel hypoplasia in several adults, suggest episodes of nutritional stress during development. Yet paradoxically, isotopic signatures in collagen, delta-1,3C and delta-1,5N, on a subset of individuals indicate elevated marine protein consumption relative to inland contemporaries. Delta-1,5N values cluster around 10-12 per thousand in these people, whereas local farming populations generally register closer to 6-8 per thousand. That isotopic signal aligns with the shells and literal pottery fragments we find in the ditch, knitting diet and material culture together in a way that speaks of coherent lifeways rather than disparate, single-item exchanges. Now, let's be fair, Measurements and isotopes do not make identities, they make patterns to be interpreted. Several plausible models have been put forward by researchers and local historians alike. The least sensational explanation is biological variation combined with selective burial. Perhaps the region supported a genetically taller subgroup or a set of families with better childhood nutrition, and the burial cluster represents elite members whose graves were deliberately differentiated by basalt markers and shell offerings. That would account for stature and some of the diet differences without invoking migration. Yet this model struggles with the dental filing and the specific combination of maritime wear, which seem culturally specific rather than purely nutritional. A second, more migratory scenario posits that these buried people were newcomers, coastal dwellers who moved inland either seasonally or for longer periods, carrying their dietary habits, mortuary rites, and craft specializations with them. This explains the elevated marine isotopes, the presence of coastal pottery types, and the dental modification. It also fits ethnographic parallels where coastal groups maintain distinct bodily practices in diaspora. The evidence of perimortem trauma could then be read two ways, as evidence of violence between newcomers and locals, or as casualties of conflict on some other front whose dead were interred here. If they were migrants, why did they settle, even temporarily, at this particular threshold? Environmental data. The expansion of traversable corridors as woodlands thinned and certain streams became easier to cross provides a plausible ecological opening that makes seasonal migration or even the forced movement of people conceivable. A third theory pushes deeper into social and ritual complexity. These graves belong to a specialist cohort, boatmen, metalworkers, or religious specialists, whose social role required distinctive funerary treatment. In this interpretation, dental filing, basalt slabs, and shell deposits operate as markers of office or apprenticeship rather than ethnic origin. The perimortem trauma might reflect ritualized violence connected to initiation rites or sacrificial practices rather than hostile conflict. Some historical analogues show specialist groups who undergo bodily alteration and unique funerary rites that set them apart within larger societies, serving both functional and symbolic roles. Still, this model requires us to accept that the community in question possessed an institutional structure capable of maintaining such specialization, a significant assertion for a site whose material footprint is modest. And then there is the mythic thread, the one that draws eyes in local taverns and spins into legend, giants, and lost tribes. Oral traditions collected in the 19th and 20th centuries recount stories of long-limbed people who once camped in the hollow and men who wore shells on their belts. Shepherds' tales and dirge songs keep repeating motifs of unusual height and strange rites, and though folklore scholars warn us about the distorting lens of centuries, repetition itself can hint at a real memory transformed by time. Written accounts from a 17th century parish register, a curious, seldom cited source, mention older stones and taller bones, found while deepening a field ditch. Language vague enough to be poetic and specific enough to intrigue. Importantly, myths do end up shaping behavior. If a community tells itself that a place held giants or sea people, that narrative alters how later people treat the ground, whether they place basalt stones, whether they avoid building, whether they come to bury certain dead in particular spots. Myth, that is an actor as much as artifact. But here's where it gets tricky in a forensic sense. Any one dataset can be overfitted to a favorite theory. Is a perimortem cranial fracture evidence of battlefield violence, interpersonal feud, or ritualized killing? Are elevated delta-1,5N values proof of maritime origin or the result of consuming freshwater fish from nutrient-rich rivers, which in certain isotopic contexts can mimic marine signals? Could dental filing be a post-mortem alteration misread in degraded enamel? The methodological pitfalls are many, and the lab work is never neutral. For that reason, multidisciplinary triangulation is crucial. Osteology, isotopic chemistry, artifact typology, and careful stratigraphy together can constrain the wildest inferences. At Bastogne, independent labs cross-checked isotopic assays, osteologists blind-coded stature estimates, typologists compared pottery temper and form to coastal and inland corpora. The result is not certainty but a richer, multi-voiced map of possibilities. Imagine, for a moment, walking among the grave cuts at dusk. The air cools quickly in the low hollow. Basalt slabs glint faintly as clouds pass the sun. You kneel and see incised marks at the edge of one slab, shallow, parallel strokes that might be maker's marks, might be ritual tallying, might be idle graffiti left by later children. You run a gloved finger along a burial shaft and feel the compacted earth that has held bodies for 2,000 years. In that intimate scene, the scientific labels fall away, and what remains is human care for the dead, fear of forgetting, the labor of memorialization. That human core is why the burial cluster moves us. It is not only an archaeological puzzle but a record of grief and identity. A reflective insight emerges from the layered biographies of these bones. Human identity in the ancient world, as in ours, was crafted from the interlacing of diet, craft, death rites, and storytelling. The bodies in these graves were not static emblems. They were travelers, workers, kin, possibly refugees, and certainly subjects of memory. The burial cluster at Bastogne forces us to consider that identity can be mobile and that the material traces of that mobility may stubbornly refuse our tidy categories. We can characterize the dead in many useful technical ways: metric outliers, isotopic eaters of marine protein, bearers of dental modification. But those labels are scaffolding, not the full house. In the quiet after excavation, the story that lingers is of communities negotiating belonging. Who gets basalt slabs, who receives shell offerings, and who is left in simple cuts in the earth. And yet, after all the measurement and narrative, we return to a patient conclusion that must be said plainly. The burial cluster offers powerful hints and stubborn contradictions, but it does not hand over a single, definitive account of who these people were or why they were buried as they were. There are multiple plausible reconstructions, each with strengths and gaps, each requiring assumptions the evidence cannot fully support. So we close this segment as we must close each, we still don't know. The carved stones around the Bastogne outpost look like a stubborn alphabet written in the weather of rock, a one-line tease that promises a message but refuses easy translation. Imagine them first as objects in space, 3 large basalt blocks set at irregular intervals along the rim of the hollow, each roughly waist-high when standing on the inside lip and oriented so that their incisions face the interior of the ditch rather than the outside world. The largest stone measures 1.45 meters by 0.9 meters at its face and stands about 0.95 meters tall from the disturbed turf. The 2 smaller stones are about 1.05 by 0.65 meters and 0.88 by 0.5 meters respectively. The incisions themselves are shallow grooves, typically 2 to 6 millimeters deep and rarely wider than 8 millimeters, their lengths varying from single short strokes of 3 to 5 centimeters to longer lines approaching 40 centimeters that curve with a slight, practiced hand. Petrologically, the basalt is local, quarried from a now wooded escarpment 2 kilometers to the west, but the workmanship is unexpectedly refined. The grooves have a consistent groove profile under microscopy, a hint that a metal point or hardened bone tool was dragged with intentional pressure rather than produced by accidental flaking or crude pecking. When epigraphers first came to the site, their excitement was cautious. The incisions lacked the clear serifs and recognizable letterforms that would allow a confident assignment to known scripts. Yet certain recurrent motifs appear: a paired double stroke that resembles an angular H, without crossbar, a sweeping hook line that terminates in a dot, a sequence of 3 parallel incisions separated by a small notch. These motifs recur on the 3 stones and on 2 smaller portable fragments found in the fill of a secondary pit nearby. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal embedded in a thin protective packing layer beneath the largest stone cluster tightly in the early 2nd century C, roughly 140 to 180 C calibrated, which aligns them with the later occupation phase we have seen in other parts of the outpost. The placement of one stone also corresponds to a slight leveling event visible in the stratigraphy, a human-arranged bed of compacted pebble and clay under the base suggesting deliberate siting rather than random field clearance. That timing, 2nd century C, is notable because it sits in the long shadow of Roman presence and local social flux. The Roman Empire's roads and markets had created a dense network of material forms and literate practices, Yet many communities continued to employ older symbolic traditions or hybridize Roman and indigenous marks. Here, then, are stones that, at first glance, could be either local emulation of script, ritual markers, or something more private. One careful optical stylistic analysis compared the grooves to forms of continental runiform incisions known from coastal and northern regions and found suggestive, not definitive, parallels. For example, the paired double-stroke motif echoes certain late Iron Age votive marks. The hooked stroke with dot appears in a few isolated inscriptions in maritime contexts where seafarers left tally marks. But similarity is not proof. The stones refuse binary classification, and that refusal is both maddening and intoxicating. Multiple competing theories have been proposed. The most conservative asserts that the incisions are practical quarrying or alignment marks. In many ancient and medieval quarries, masons and stonecutters scored shallow lines as guides for splitting or transported tools. These marks were not meant to be symbolic. This theory gains some traction given the local basalt outcrops and the presence, in the broader landscape, of quarrying scars consistent with small-scale extraction. If quarrying marks explain the grooves, the stones facing inward might be a later decision. The stones were reused and intentionally positioned to face the hollow at the time the ditch was in use, repurposing functional artifacts into a different context. That explanation is tidy and appeals to economical reuse of materials across time. A second theory is epigraphic. The incisions constitute a local script, a compact system of marks used by a restricted group, perhaps the Outpost community or a guild of itinerant craftsmen, to record ownership, rights, or navigational information. This idea is bolstered by the repetition of motifs across multiple stones, and the occasional grouping suggesting sequences. If these are indeed marks of a local script, they challenge assumptions about the spread of literacy and the forms it took in peripheral communities. Rather than adopting Latin letters wholesale, local people might have elaborated their own mnemonic systems adapted to carving on stone or bone. The shallow depth and simple geometry of the grooves would fit a utilitarian script designed for quick notation rather than public display. Yet the absence of a clear bilingual inscription, say, one carved alongside a Latin graffito, leaves the epigraphic case underdetermined. A third, and for many the most compelling, theory leans into ritual. Here the stones are not meant to be read as a text but experienced as a tactile and visual choreography. Incisions act as ritual tally marks, sequences of offerings, or directional notches aligning rites to the landscape. Support for this reading comes from the stone's orientation toward the hollow and the presence of other ritual paraphernalia, marine shells, carefully crushed charcoal lenses, and a small cache of work bone in the immediate area. Comparative ritual archaeologists point to examples across Europe where carved stones served as way stations in a sacred route, acting as mnemonic anchors for oral liturgy. On certain mornings, the grooves might catch the light in a specific way, or the arrangement of stones could frame the notch of horizon pertinent to a seasonal rite. Across human history, marks on rock become anchors for memory, a way to make stories that will outlast breath and generation. A fourth, more speculative theory entertains the idea of a coded map or navigational aid. The outpost sits, as we've seen, on a threshold where inland routes and hydrological corridors occasionally open and close over decades. Traders and seafarers who made seasonal moves inland would benefit from a shared set of tactile cues to guide covert approaches. Imagine a guild of mariners who painted or carved minimal notches on stones when a route was safe, returning later to interpret the code. In this model, the paired strokes, hooked marks, and serial parallels are a compact semiotic system indicating river conditions, safe fording spots, or the presence of trustworthy hosts. This theory fits the broader pattern of coastal material culture at the site and explains the continuity of certain motifs across multiple stones. Yet it demands a level of organized, repeated practice that the modest scale of the outpost makes only plausible if these people were part of a wider network that replicated the code across many loci. Then there is the mythic layer, which locals and old manuscripts never fail to provide. Tales retold in Hamlet kitchens speak of a speech in stone, left by giants or by sea people, who carved messages for their children. A 17th-century parish note, preserved in a monk's marginalia, mentions Marks that resemble the signs of the strangers. Found on stones turned up while digging foundations. The monk's contemporaneous theologizing reads like an attempt to domesticate the uncanny. Every strange sign must fit into God's order or else mark an abiding sin. Folklore scholars caution against taking such sources as literal evidence, but the recurrence of motifs in oral culture matters. Narratives can conserve structural knowledge about landscape use, ritual timing, or taboo areas. If local tales remembered an emissive class of people who left marks on stones, perhaps the stones indeed encoded group identity in a manner legible to insiders but opaque to outsiders. No theory, however, is immune to technical critique. Micromorphological analysis shows a thin accretion layer in the grooves consistent with long exposure and biological colonization, arguing that the incisions are ancient rather than modern graffiti. Yet lichenometry and other surface weathering estimates can offer only relative agreements. They cannot pin the moment of carving with absolute precision. Attempts to read the incisions as an alphabet have been frustrated by the lack of recurrence at scale. A true writing system tends to produce long sequences and variant contexts, graffiti, formal inscriptions, portable labels, whereas here the sequences are short and discrete. Some scholars suggest that the marks are a proto-writing, mnemonic devices sufficient for community memory but not a full lexicon, and thus will resist attempts to decode, in the modern sense. Picture yourself once more kneeling at the largest stone. The morning sun is thin and a bird calls somewhere beyond the ridge. You put your hand to a groove and feel the cool of stone, the ridge of minute pebbles under your palm. Your imagination wants the marks to resolve into a message. Welcome, beware, this way to see. But the real experience is different. The grooves are deliberate. Their logic is local. Their import may have been participatory rather than propositional. That is, the stones possibly meant as much in how they were made and used, the ritual act of marking, the shared knowledge of what each stroke meant in performance, as in transmitting a literal instruction. This subtle distinction between text as message and mark as performance is crucial because it reframes how we approach archaeological epigraphy. Some marks are designed for repeated communal enactment, not for silent reading by strangers. And there are still more avenues of inquiry. Geophysical surveys reveal faint alignments of negative anomalies that extend beyond the visible stones, linear shallow cuts and post holes that, when plotted, suggest a ring of ritual markers that once encircled the broader zone. Observations from archaeoastronomers note a minor, but repeatable, alignment. At the equinox dawn, the hooked stroke on the largest stone casts a shadow that bisects the interior of the hollow, striking a small hearth-like depression near the ditch's center. Is that design or coincidence? Cataloging such alignments is treacherous. Our brains are excellent pattern-seeking machines and poor judges of randomness. Yet repeated correlations across independent observations merit respect and further study. If deliberate alignment existed, the stones could have functioned as instruments indexing solar and seasonal cycles, a domestic almanac carved in basalt. A final thought is reflective and human. Carved stones are the ancient world's social media. They are an attempt to communicate across time with a durability that wood and cloth cannot match. Whether the incisions at Bastogne are quarry marks, a private script, ritual tallying, navigational codes, or something none of those, they share a common thread: someone wanted to make the place speak. That desire to leave a message, to make a mark that will persist, ties us intimately to those who touched the basalt 2,000 years ago. You might run your fingers along the groove and feel that kinship, the same impulse that drives us to sign our names in notebooks or carve initials on a park bench is at play. The stones are thus less about content than about continuity, human hands marking a world that keeps changing. And yet, after the microscopes and the shadow studies and the speculative mappings, we return to the stubborn lacuna. The carved stones at Bastogne are eloquent in craftsmanship but mute in message. They open doors to interpretation but do not lead to a single, well-lit room where meaning sits waiting. So we must close this section as we have closed others. We still don't know. One thread that refuses to be ignored is the Outpost's inventory of metalwork and the faint, stubborn echo of fires, a single-sentence teaser that both glints and worries. The metals at Bastogne bear signatures of far mountains and molten practice that shouldn't be here. Picture, if you will, The small cache of worked bronze and slag recovered in a shallow refuse pit a scant 10 meters from the hollow circle, a broken body of a small bronze pin 32 millimeters in length, a flattened disc with concentric tooling marks measuring roughly 48 millimeters across, a fragment of a thin bronze strip with soldered joins, and a scatter of glassy slag the size of a child's thumbnail. Metallurgical analysis, performed by laboratories using portable XRF and later confirmed by ICP-MES on powdered samples, showed the bronze to be a copper-tin alloy with trace bismuth and elevated antimony. The lead isotope ratios, when plotted against known ore fields, align most closely with alpine deposits exploited in the high valleys of the Central Massif, rather than with local ores historically used in the region. The slag's microstructure tells a story of localized smelting at low to moderate temperatures and of on-site working rather than a high-capacity industrial furnace. It's the handiwork of tinkers, not state foundries. Radiocarbon contexts supplied by charcoal flex in the same pitfall in the early 2nd century CE window that has haunted other parts of the site. In other words, the metalworking episode, whatever its true social meaning, is contemporaneous with the ditch closure, the carved stones, and the cluster of burials we have already considered. The problem, of course, is reconciling the presence of alpine-sourced metal with a modest inland hollow that shows no signs of heavy industry. One avenue of interpretation leans on long-distance exchange. Raw ores, ingots, or partly worked pieces could circulate on trade networks that moved along riverine routes and overland passes, so that local craftsmen could melt and reshape imported metal in small workshops. That model makes sense within a Roman-era economy in which markets and itinerant craftspeople redistributed raw materials across surprising distances. Portable smiths might have carried a small toolkit and a crucible, drawing on locally available charcoal to melt alloy and patch tools on site. In that case, Bastogne's metalwork would be part of a larger mercantile ecology that stretched from mountain mines to urban centers, with small nodes like this outpost serving functional niches. Another credible hypothesis considers the social dimension. Metalworking can be a marker of special status and of ritual practice. Bronze pins and small decorated discs are often associated with costume and identity, badges of office, markers of rank, or components of ritual paraphernalia. The careful soldering and concentric tooling might suggest an object intended for visibility rather than utility, items meant to be seen at a gathering, toe jewelry or insignia worn during rite and removed afterward. In ritual contexts across many times and places, metal objects are curated and treated differently from ordinary household refuse. They are deposited in specific loci, sometimes deliberately broken, sometimes wrapped and hidden. If what we see at Bastogne is a ritual cache, then the alpine isotopic signature need not imply indigenous alpine miners present, only that the object was part of trans-regional exchange networks of goods that also carry meaning. A third line of thought presses into the question of itinerant specialists and the social geography of craft. The archaeological record contains many examples of mobile metalworkers and itinerant coppersmiths who moved with the seasons, joining agricultural cycles or following fairs and caravan routes. These specialists often operated at a scale that left modest material residue, small crucibles, reheating hearths, and thin slag, exactly the kinds of remains found in the refuse pit. If the Bastogne outpost served as a seasonal workshop frequented by such craftsmen, the presence of alpine-sourced metal is less an outlier and more a natural consequence of a mobile trading economy. This model also fits isotopic indications of marine protein in some individuals. Itinerant networks combine coastal and alpine products, moving expertise and materials in complex circuits rather than straight lines. But here's where it gets tricky. Technological signatures can mislead when read in isolation. Lead isotope matching provides a probabilistic, not deterministic, link to ore fields. Similar isotopic fields can exist in multiple, geographically distinct deposits, and contamination or mixing complicates straightforward assignment. Moreover, bronze objects can receive repairs, rialas, and additions over generations. A piece with alpine lead signatures could have been recycled many times, sourcing metal from multiple origins across its lifespan. The disc with concentric tooling may have originated as a coastal decorative object centuries earlier, been traded inland, remade, and resoldered by someone working in the hollow's workshop. Each stage of reuse erases and overlays histories, making the object's origin a palimpsest rather than a single provenance. Imagine standing above the refuse pit as smoke from an archaeologist's small stove curls into the gray afternoon. You scoop a sampling of weathered charcoal, and your gloved fingers come away sticky with soil. A tiny glint catches the sun, a rusted sliver of bronze. In that private, hands-on moment it is easy to lapse into simple narratives. The alpine miner, the traveling smith, the ritual badge, because objects beg for stories. The disciplined muse, however, demands that we hold multiple strands simultaneously: technology, trade, ritual, reuse, and the mundane reality that everyday items circulate in messy, nonlinear ways. There is a social geometry to metallurgy that helps us think further. Metals are, by nature, high-value and portable goods. They enable long-distance social ties because they can be carried easily relative to their worth. Small nodes like Bastogne could serve as redistribution centers where itinerant specialists exchange services for graying or lodging, repaired tools for farmers, or modified objects into regionally intelligible forms, a bronze pin retooled into a hair ornament more in keeping with inland aesthetics, for example. Such bricolage could account for hybrid objects, a disc with tooling suggesting coastal aesthetics paired with soldering techniques learned in Alpine or Rome-influenced workshops. The result is cultural syncretism at the scale of everyday material practice. Yet a darker possibility warrants attention. Metalworking, especially when allied with unusual burial practices and perimortem trauma, can signal craft specialization tied to violent or paramilitary functions. Weapons and their repair are part of any conflict economy, and itinerant smiths sometimes follow armed groups, maintaining blades and repairing harnesses. The robust limb attachments and healed trauma in some skeletons might suggest people who handled heavy loads and combat equipment. The cache of worked metal could be parts of accoutrement, not merely jewelry. If conflict played a role, whether in local feuds, raiding, or as part of larger imperial skirmishes, the outpost might have been a repair depot, clandestine and mobile to avoid attracting the attention of formal authorities. That scenario would neatly combine metallurgical evidence, skeletal stress markers, and the hollow circle's secrecy. We must also briefly entertain an imaginative leap, because this site has a way of encouraging wild thought. What if some of the alpine metal got to Bastogne not as ore or finished goods but as the product of itinerant metallurgists who had learned distinctive alloying recipes from mountain communities, recipes that incorporated trace elements for reasons now opaque to us? In some ethnographic contexts, alloy compositions carry symbolic as well as functional value. An extra trace element might mark an object as belonging to a particular lineage or smithing tradition. If such ethnotechnical identities existed here, we might be seeing the fingerprints of cultural signifiers coded in metallurgy. The temptation to romanticize is strong, but the historical record offers examples of craft traditions so closely guarded that they become identity markers. So the thought is not sheer fantasy, it is an invitation to consider the cultural life of technology. If you close your eyes and place yourself beside the small hearth near the refuse pit, you can almost feel the heat that once softened metal, smell the black tang of charcoal, and hear the ring of a hammer on anvil. Women and men move in choreographed steps, passing crucibles, holding tongs, filing edges, speaking in low tones punctuated by laughter and command. A bronze pin is shaped. The solder is applied with heat that draws off a thin blue smoke. Then the object is used in a ceremony at the hollow circle, perhaps affixed to a cloak and later intentionally broken and deposited in the pit as part of a ritual of closure. Such scenes are speculative reconstructions, yes, but they are grounded in the kinds of domestic and ritual economies we document elsewhere. So what do we take away from the metals and furnaces of Bastogne? The simplest lesson is that the outpost was a node of technological and social connectivity. It was not an industrial center, nor a mere domestic yard. It was a place where expertise, material, and meaning intersected. Whether those intersections were commercial, ritual, martial, or some mixture of all three, they speak to a world where resources and identities circulated across landscapes in ways that challenge our neat periodizations. There is something profoundly modern about that ancient mobility, the interweaving of distant ores and local hearths, alpine signatures and inland graves, craft, and ceremony. The people who worked here participated in networks that were at once intimate and broad. And yet, after tracing the metallurgical thread, we must return to the cautious refrain that has become our companion through this investigation. The evidence is rich, technical, and tantalizingly suggestive, but it does not yield a single, definitive story about the meaning of metal at Bastogne. There are robust possibilities, itinerant specialists, ritual caches, repair depots, and identity-making alloys, and each explains parts of the data while leaving other parts unresolved. The pit's contents and the associated dates anchor a plausible narrative, but the margins of interpretation remain wide. So, for the sake of honesty and the preservation of mystery that has made this place so compelling, we must say again what we have said before and will say again: we still don't know. The outpost at Bastogne refuses to settle into a single story because it is stubbornly multiple, a hollow circle that looks domestic but behaves like a secret, graves that read like local bones wearing foreign customs, basalt stones that carve a private language in the landscape, and metals that bear the fingerprints of mountains and coasts far beyond the valley. When you put all those threads side by side, ditch, burial, stone, furnace, you do not get neat closure. You get a braided rope of possibilities that each tug at a different part of what it means to be human in motion. That braided rope is, in fact, the argument of this place. People moved, things moved with them, rites traveled as easily as pots, and memory braided myth and fact until they could hardly be separated. In the end, the outpost asks less for answers than for a different posture toward the past, one that is curious, provisional, and generous with ambiguity. Start with movement. The isotopes in teeth and bone, the presence of marine microfossils in inland pottery, the alpine lead signatures in bronze, these are not romantic metaphors but measurable traces of travel. They tell us that long before modern highways stitched regions together, human beings maintained circuits that joined coasts, uplands, and valleys in ways that were adaptive and often temporary. Seasonal corridors opened and closed with climate and human labor. Specialists, smiths, mariners, traders, moved along those corridors carrying not only goods but techniques and rites. The hollow circle may have been, at different moments, a place to work, to worship, to hide, or to bury. It was, at minimum, an intersection where the itinerant and the settled met. That meeting need not have been peaceful, and the bones with paramortem trauma remind us that movement and contact could lead to conflict as often as to exchange. But conflict and exchange are both forms of social negotiation. They mark the rhythms by which communities define themselves against others. The people who passed through Bastogne reshaped the local social map simply by passing through. Second, consider ritual and memory. The deliberate placement of basalt stones facing inward, the curated deposits in the ditch, the pattern of shells and careful slab markers in the graves. These do not read like casual loss. They read like choices meant to be seen, felt, and remembered. Material culture at Bastogne shows repeated acts of deposition and care, items selected, sometimes altered, sometimes purposely broken, and placed with intention. These acts manufacture memory. They are attempts to fix an event into the world so it will be visible to others later. In that sense, ritual is a technology of persistence. The carved grooves on stone also participate in this technology. Whether they were a compact navigational code, a local script, or ritual tallying, their very existence signals a group working to make certain knowledge durable. The cracks and grooves in the rock are not just marks, they are voices raised against forgetting. Third, weigh the role of craft and economy. Metalworking at the outpost is not the work of an industrial hub, but it is the work of purposeful hands engaged in technologically meaningful acts. Bronze alloys brought from afar, modest slag indicative of small-scale furnaces, and work items that blur the line between utility and identity suggest a mixed economy of craft, trade, and symbolic use. Some objects were tools, some were ornaments, and some were markers of office or group identity. Craftspeople, whether itinerant or local, were actors in a wider social theater. They mended weapons, they fashioned jewelry for rites, they recycled and hybridized materials so that new identities could be signaled with familiar-looking artifacts. The technology at Bastogne is a social technology. metallurgy made and remade relationships. Fourth, hold the tension between myth and method. Local oral traditions speak of long-limbed people, of stones that hum, of speech written in grooves. Science offers measurements, dates, isotopes, and microscopic pictures of groove profiles. Both are valuable. Myth is not the opposite of truth, it is a different grammar for remembering things that matter. Scientific data do not dissolve myth but can anchor it, giving historians and archaeologists dimensions to work from. In Bastogne, the recurrence of particular motifs in folklore, repeated descriptions of taller people, of stone marks, of sea objects placed in land, is a signal that memory preserved some core of unusual experience, even if that experience was reshaped by generations of storytelling. Bringing myth and method together does not force myth into the laboratory nor drag lab data into the tavern. Rather, it lets us see how people have always used material and narrative together to make sense of the uncategorizable. Fifth, accept the methodological humility the site demands. Stratigraphic complexity, potential contamination in samples, and the palimpsest nature of recycled objects mean that every dataset carries caveats. Radiocarbon ranges give us windows, not frames. Lead isotope matching supplies likelihoods, not certainties. Osteological measurements map to estimates of stature and activity patterns that have margins of error. The proper scientific posture for Bastogne is therefore probabilistic. We assemble models that explain clusters of data better than rivals, and we revise those models as new evidence appears. That humility does not mean embracing every crazy idea. It means calibrating confidence to the strength of evidence. Sometimes the most honest statement is not a theory but a question. In every segment of this Outpost story we have had to come back to the same patient admission: we still don't know. And yet, despite the provisionality, certain conclusions feel secure enough to carry forward into the larger human story. The first is that peripheries matter. Places like Bastogne are not marginal simply because they have fewer monuments. They are critical nodes in the connective tissue of the past. They are where the messy work of exchange, negotiation, and memory takes place, where people actually met, argued, traded, loved, buried, and lit hearths. Histories that privilege capitals and great roads risk missing the steady, diffuse motion that shapes cultures. Bastogne, in its modesty, shows us how peripheries can be central to our understanding of movement and identity. The second secure insight is about continuity. The human drives that shape the Outpost, curiosity, belonging, fear, craft, and the desire to leave a trace, are familiar to us. When you touch the carved groove or lift a shard, you encounter impulses that have not changed in essence: the desire to communicate, to mark a place as belonging to someone, to fix grief in stone, to turn raw material into meaning. That continuity is both comforting and unnerving. It links us to people who are otherwise strangers. It reminds us that our ways of marking the world are part of a long human conversation. This is the emotional payoff the Outpost delivers, not a final answer but a sense of kinship across centuries. Third, Bastogne insists on a more generous epistemology. The site asks that we let multiple narratives breathe: migration and ritual, craft and secrecy, myth and method, and that we tolerate the discomfort of ambiguity. In a world hungry for simple stories, archaeological ambiguity can feel like a failure. But it is not. Ambiguity is evidence of complexity. To live with it is not to capitulate to ignorance but to respect the tangled processes that make human histories interesting. As we end, imagine one last scene. Dusk lowers itself over the valley, the basalt stones throw long, thin shadows, and the hollow circle sits like an ear cupped to the ground. The graves are soft mounds under a drape of grass, and the small refuse pit waits for the careful eyes of whoever next digs. A child of the village runs by and pauses to peer at a groove. An archaeologist wipes dust from a gloved hand and takes a sample. An old woman in the nearest hamlet tells the same story of sea people. She told as a child but with new details, because stories are living things. All of these acts, playful curiosity, methodical measurement, remembered tale, are ways of keeping the past present. They are, in their different registers, continuations of what was done in and around the Outpost by hands now long gone. So what should you, the listener, carry from Bastogne when you walk away? Take 3 things: a respect for the patchwork nature of human lives, a willingness to hold multiple models in your mind at once, and an openness to the fact that some places exist to irritate the neatness of our categories. The Outpost will not be tamed by a single narrative. It will only yield more richness if we approach it with both rigor and wonder. Finally, because you asked the story to end, I would give you the end it deserves, an honest, open finish that refuses to tidy away mystery. Bastogne has taught us that the past is not a static exhibit but a living field of inquiry, that bones and stones speak softly and often indirectly, and that human beings everywhere have always negotiated identity through movement, craft, and memory. We have walked the ditch, crouched over the graves, traced the grooves of carved stones, and sifted the metallic glints of small furnaces. We have listened to science and to story, and both have shaped how we see. There are still questions I cannot answer with certainty: who precisely carved the grooves, why certain people were buried with shells and without typical grave goods, whether the hollow circle first served a ritual or economic purpose. These questions will keep archaeologists busy, storytellers awake, and local communities engaged. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.